Welcome back to Bad Things in History, where something wicked this way comes. England was a dangerous place in the 1800s. Raw sewage could be found everywhere. Deadly diseases were rampant, and crime was extremely common. Those who could afford it wanted to escape the sights and sounds of the city. They wanted to travel and experience the finer things in life. An unfortunate series of events would ensure that hundreds of them drowned in a mixture of industrial chemicals and sewage. In this episode, we are going to explain how a troubled relationship with human waste contributed to one of the worst disasters in England's history: the Great Stink. By 1700, the City of London had a population of nearly 600,000 people. The growing mass of humanity also produced a lot of waste. At first, it was either dumped into cesspools or thrown into the River Thames. As feces became a common feature of London streets, those in charge decided it was time to improve the city's infrastructure. Over the next century, pipes were built to help drain waste into the nearby waterways, but it couldn't keep up with the city's growing population. By 1851, there were over 2.6 million people living in London. Many of them depended on sewers and pipes that were well over 100 years old. Human waste became a horrible fact of daily life. It covered the streets and lined the banks of the River Thames. In 1857, the stench was so powerful that Charles Dickens wrote, "I can certify that the offensive smells, even in that short whiff, have been of a most head and stomach distending nature." In June 1858, as the summer began, temperatures in England were unusually warm. The city's streets and the nearby river emitted such foul odors that it was unbearable for many. Michael Faraday, the scientist who helped discover electromagnetism, described the experience. Near the bridges, the feculence rolled up in clouds so dense that they were visible at the surface, even in water of this kind. The smell was very bad and common to the whole of the water. It was the same as that which now comes up from the gully holes in the streets. The whole river was, for the time, a real sewer. The smell was so horrible and pervasive that Parliament was unable to conduct their business. One day, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert tried to take a pleasure cruise on the Thames. The odors were so offensive that they had to give up and turn around. The press began referring to the event as the Great Stink. A local newspaper wrote, "Gentility of speech is at an end. It stinks, and whoso once inhales the stink can never forget it and can count himself lucky if he lives to remember it." To try and solve the problem, the city began dumping lime into the river, and they also started building new sewer pipes. By 1861, most of the buildings in London allowed their waste to flow into new pipes, but this didn't fix all the problems. The pipes deposited their waste into the Thames, but much of the city's drinking water came from the same river. So, as one set of pipes sent human waste deposits away from the city, other pipes brought some of it back to be consumed. Cholera outbreaks became a common feature of life in England. The new infrastructure did keep London from constantly emitting foul odors, so it appeared that the Great Stink was finally over. But the sewage being dumped into the river would eventually cause new problems. Pleasure gardens. In Victorian England, life in the cities was smelly, dangerous, and often depressing, but some of those among the working class found a way to prosper. As they moved up the social ladder, they wanted to find a way to enjoy the finer things in life, and they wanted to do this without having to smell human feces or interact with the poor and downtrodden in society. For those who could afford it, they could escape the horrors of everyday life by visiting pleasure gardens. The first and most famous of these was the Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens just outside London. It was closed in 1859, but other pleasure gardens continued to operate for several years. Those who could afford the experience would dress in their finest clothing. Then they would visit a pleasure garden and pay a fee to enter. The combination of dress code and entry fees kept the poorest members of society away from the area. The gardens provided several amenities. It was a pleasant place to take a stroll, but it also provided entertainment, and in some cases prostitutes were available as well. The experience was not always a safe one. In June 1863, an acrobat was performing at one of the pleasure gardens in London. He was trying to perform tricks on a high wire. Unfortunately, he fell. A first-hand account of the event described how it happened. When the wire slackened, the unfortunate man staggered and was precipitated violently to the ground on the back of his head, the blood pouring profusely from the wound and from his ears. Numbers of persons, particularly the females, were dreadfully shocked and affected, many of the corps de ballet being afterwards scarcely able to go through their performance. He was immediately removed, and the dance and music proceeded. In 1874, another daredevil tried to entertain the crowd. He built wings and attached them to his arms. When he tried to fly, it didn't work as expected. A newspaper reported the details. He came crashing through the air. The wing closed around him like a living shroud, and narrowly escaping the outer parapet, he fell with fearful violence on his head and right side in the road, immediately opposite the front entrance of St. Luke's Church. Hundreds of persons immediately rushed to his assistance and found him bleeding violently from the nose and ears and without any sign of life. Even though performers killed themselves in the name of entertainment, the gardens remained a popular and attractive destination. By the late 1800s, it became a lucrative industry. Those who could afford it would purchase passage on ships, which then took them on a tour of England's pleasure gardens. These ships also traveled through raw sewage as it poured into the Thames. Before the era of pleasure gardens ended, this human waste would also help end lives. The sinking. SS Princess Alice was a steamboat built in Scotland in 1865. By 1878, the ship was being used to provide moonlight tours. Those who could afford tickets would take a tour of all the pleasure gardens near the Thames. It was a popular leisure activity for those in the middle class who could afford it. The SS Bywell Castle was built in Newcastle in 1870. It wasn't used to ferry passengers. Instead, the ship carried coal to and from London. Both ships used the River Thames to move cargo and passengers. On the night of September 3, 1878, the vessels would have a fateful encounter with each other. Early in the day, several passengers boarded the Princess Alice in London. Most of them were there to visit a pleasure garden in Kent. The vessel delivered the passengers, and they spent the day enjoying everything the garden had to offer. As the sun began to set, the passengers returned to the ship and began their journey home. Around 7:40 p.m., the SS Princess Alice was approaching the south end of London. It was traveling in the middle of the river. The crew spotted the SS Bywell Castle coming toward them. It was moving in the opposite direction of Princess Alice. The two ships couldn't pass each other unless one of them moved. The Princess Alice turned sharply to avoid colliding with the coal ship, but instead of avoiding a collision, it placed itself right in front of Bywell Castle. The cargo ship couldn't get out of the way. It plowed into the center of the passenger ship and split Princess Alice in two. The damaged ship began sinking quickly. Within minutes, most of its passengers were dropped into the putrid water. Most would not survive. Rescue attempt. The few who survived the disaster provided harrowing accounts of the experience. Alfred Thomas Merriman was a 30-year-old chef. He wasn't supposed to be working on this day. He was asked to provide his services at the last minute and agreed because the extra pay was too tempting. He was standing on deck talking about how wonderful the trip had been. At that moment, he saw the Bywell Castle coming right at the ship. Alfred said the passengers knew they were in danger. The panic on board was terrible, the women and children screaming and rushing to the bridge for safety. When the Princess Alice split in two, those below decks were trapped. They could not save themselves and quickly drowned. The passengers lucky enough to be above decks were dropped in the river. Alfred Merriman was among them, though he was lucky enough to survive the experience. The crew members of the Bywell Castle began trying to save the survivors immediately. They threw planks of wood, life preservers, and anything else that would float. However, since most of the drowning passengers spent their day at a pleasure garden, they were dressed in their finest clothes. As the heavy Victorian clothing was saturated with water, it became very heavy. Many of the well-dressed passengers were dragged to the bottom of the river where they drowned. Those who remained above the surface of the water noticed that it was putrid and boiling. They coughed while trying to breathe the toxic fumes created by the large amount of raw sewage. One man who survived described how unpleasant the experience was. "I noticed something very peculiar in the water. Both the taste and smell were something dreadful, something that I could not describe. Having been down to the bottom and having rose again with my mouth full of it, I could give a very good picture of it. It was the most horrid water I ever tasted, and the smell was also equally bad." About 130 people were pulled from the water. At least 16 of them died later from illnesses caused by ingesting the raw sewage. Most of the other survivors became sick as well, but eventually recovered. Nobody is sure how many died in the accident. It is estimated that 640 passengers drowned when the Princess Alice broke apart. Over the next several days, people worked to recover the bodies of those who died. However, after being immersed in the water, the corpses were covered in slime. The chemicals in the river also caused the dead to begin rotting faster than they normally would. The combination of decomposition and sewage created an unbearable stench. The families of those who died saw their grief turn to anger. They wanted to know who was responsible for killing their loved ones. Aftermath. The coroner began an inquest into the accident. At the same time, the Board of Trade began looking into the event too. The Board of Trade was a government agency responsible for managing trade and commerce. A jury heard evidence in the inquest and determined that both vessels were at fault. They ruled that the SS Princess Alice did not act correctly when making its final turn. The SS Bywell Castle did not react fast enough to what was happening once they realized a collision was possible. The Board of Trade had a different opinion. It ruled that the SS Princess Alice was completely at fault. Ships were supposed to pass each other by moving to the right side of the channel. Princess Alice did exactly the opposite, which then caused the accident. Nobody was ever prosecuted or imprisoned for the accident. The disaster exposed the true dangers of England's human waste problem. Changes were implemented to try and deal with the problem. Around 1880, London began treating sewage before dumping it into the river. For the waste that could not be purified, it was loaded on ships and taken out into the North Sea. The sewage was then dumped into international waters. The SS Bywell Castle and its remaining crew would meet their own unfortunate end. In 1883, the ship was seen off the coast of Portugal for the last time. The Bywell Castle and those serving on it were never seen again. London's sewer system would have to be upgraded many times in the 20th century to deal with the city's growing population. The next major upgrade is scheduled to be completed in 2024. Was this accident the result of incompetence? Or was it perhaps just a series of unfortunate events? Let us know what you think about this tragedy in the comments below. We hope you never have to swim in raw sewage. We also hope that if you learned something from this episode, you'll repay our hard work by pressing the like button. If you want to see more strange tales like this in the future, be sure to subscribe as well. Stay safe and beware foul odors. Thank you for watching Bad Things in History.